Hey there, this is Women on the Brink. I'm your host, Chris Jeffrey, a registered acupuncturist and wellness advisor with a passion for helping women live happier and more balanced lives. When I'm away from work, I'm usually outside in nature, either walking the seawall or I'm hiking in the mountains. And like many of you, my life has been filled with moments of hardship, some that I thought I couldn't overcome and really left me questioning my own strength. But through these challenges, I discovered resilience, courage, and a renewed sense of purpose. So I'm here to share not just my journey, but the lessons I've learned, and to remind you that no matter what obstacles come your way, there's always a path forward. And just to let you know, this podcast is not prescriptive, it's an offering. So please take what resonates with you and leave the rest. Today on Women on the Brink, we have a special guest, Leah Hawley, who's here to share her Brinking experience with us. So Leah left the corporate world to embrace the chaos and the beauty of being a stay-at-home mom to her two amazing neurodiverse daughters. But something very unexpected happened to Leah after her two kids were born. She developed PMDD, which is Premenstrual Dysphoric Disorder. And this is a much more severe type of premenstrual syndrome. So symptoms include a much deeper form of depression, as well as a bunch of physical problems, which Leah will get into. So if you're experiencing postpartum depression or symptoms of premenstrual dysphoric disorder, please contact a trusted healthcare provider. So, without further ado, Leah is here to discuss her story of how this condition and some of the other external things going on in her life at the time took her to the brink. So, she'll be sharing with us how she had to dig really deep to find a way to heal and find her self-worth. So, Leah, welcome to Women on the Brink. We're really grateful to have you here, and thank you for coming forward with your story.
Yeah, thank you. It's wonderful to be here. I'm very excited.
So, can you tell us what was going on with you after your daughters were born? Like, was this something that came on suddenly or did it build up over time?
Yeah, well, hindsight's 2020, right? And
Mm-hmm.
when I reflect back over my life, I can see that I probably have always been sensitive to hormone fluctuations, but within the normal range, able to navigate it with, lifestyle, good sleep, good stress management. And then when my first daughter was born, at about the 6-week mark, I developed postpartum depression. And it came on quite distinctly and quite suddenly. Like I remember feeling this very different shift that happened in my brain. And all of a sudden I felt like this is not me. I don't know what this is, but it felt very not me, the way I would normally operate. Yet I didn't identify though, nor did I have the typical symptoms of what's presented around postpartum depression. I mean, I could get dressed, I could take care of my baby, I could keep a clean house. I wasn't sitting in a corner crying, but I definitely was experiencing postpartum depression and yet using my high functioning skill set to mask and cover what was really going on. And so I think, having children kind of created an even greater crack in the foundation. And then, there was additional life stressors that were happening around that time, some, serious illnesses within the family, as well as, a number of deaths that happened quite quickly in succinct order with a number of family members. So, there was an environment of intense stress. And
Yeah.
that in conjunction with probably what I was somewhat predisposed to, being more sensitive to hormones, that then once breastfeeding was done and my cycle started again, that's when the more severe symptoms of the PMDD, what I now know as PMDD, were apparent and obvious.
Right. So, this was a new experience for you altogether, right? This was a new journey into the unknown, and you had to start figuring this out for yourself. Because PMDD, there's just a very small percentage of the female population that actually experience this. Is that right?
Yeah, I mean, no, granted, there's probably a lot of undiagnosed cases out there because so there's postpartum depression, perimenopause, menopause.
Yeah, yeah.
PMDD, they often get dismissed or overlooked or not properly diagnosed. So, yeah, I mean, statistically speaking, it's only about 3 to 8% of women that fall into the category of having a PMDD diagnosis. And then within that, it's interesting, there's a subset, another category of neurodiverse women. And statistically, 92% of women who are diagnosed on the autism spectrum have PMDD, and 46% of women diagnosed with ADHD have PMDD. So it clearly affects a subset of the female population differently than the overarching population of women.
Right. That is so interesting. So, did you have a lot of support from your friends, your family? I mean, how was it? I know our medical system here is pretty overtaxed. How were you finding support for this condition?
Yeah, when you're right in the thick of something, it's really hard to see clearly to even understand what's happening. So I did not have family or peer support. I certainly, at various junctures reached out to the medical community, and I would go in saying, here are some of my symptoms. And they'd say, oh, well, it's normal to have irregular bleeding or really heavy bleeding, or, for your cycle to not be quite right after you finish breastfeeding. It wasn't that the doctors were blowing off the symptoms, but they just really could have fallen in a huge bucket of many possible diagnoses,
Hmm.
right? And because there's no clear, easy test to identify it. So, my diagnosis for PMDD actually took 10 years.
Wow.
And it took me going from specialist to specialist to specialist to specialist until finally I begged, absolutely begged to see an endocrinologist. Bless this man. He, within an hour of interviewing me, said, I know exactly what's happening to you. And I just about collapsed. It was like, finally, after a decade, somebody can understand what's happening here. And, because what happens inside for a woman as you're going through this, or at least for me, was you start to think, what's wrong with me? If I only tried harder, if I could only get to the root of this, and in our day and age with so much self-help and all this stuff out there, it was like, do I have some trauma that I haven't addressed? It's like, well, I don't think so. I've gone through heaps of counseling. It's like, do I have some, nutritional deficiencies? So, not only over the decade was I advocating hard within the medical system for myself, which is exhausting when you've got 2 young children, but I was also spending thousands of dollars seeing all these other professionals that would say, oh, no problem. This will definitely help, but nothing was helping. And then that sense of hopelessness and despair um, just grew deeper and deeper within inside. It becomes this very isolating closet experience of this kind of silent terror of, is there something really wrong with me? And am I going to have to live like this for the rest of my life? Because I was always inches away from driving myself to the emergency and saying, like, you need to admit me. Like, I can't function.
Wow. I know there's a lot of different symptoms of PMDD. What were you experiencing specifically?
Yeah, my specific symptoms were they ranged from physical to mental to emotional. So at the physical level, my cycle was no longer a 27-day cycle. I was bleeding about 20 days out of 27 days of every month. And that was even being on the birth control pill. Like, they tried to use the pill to override my system. My brain was no longer responding to any hormonal support that was put into my system. It was overriding everything. There's, excessive bleeding, frequent bleeding, heavy bleeding, flooding, clotting, like to the point where I'd be out in public and there would be a gush that would come out of nowhere, and you'd have to bring a change of clothes, and there were times the clots were so big I would faint.
Oh,
Um,
God.
so you've got this physical energy depletion that's happening.
I was going to say that's got to affect your iron levels, right? And then your energy, of course.
Yeah, everything. And then it's it's the spiral. So along with those physical symptoms, and there was the sense of brain fog and lack of clarity and this inability to kind of make decisions the way I used to make decisions and feel like I was on top of things. There was always the sense of unpredictability. I didn't know if I was going to wake up each morning being able to function or have a non-functioning day.
Wow.
Like typically with PMDD, it's like the last half of the cycle that's really difficult for women. But for me, it was because of the irregular bleeding, it was the whole thing. My pattern was to have no pattern. That's what the doctor.
Right.
So, these symptoms can often not present in a typical way, which makes it difficult for the doctors to diagnose. And then, of course, there's the emotional side where, there's insomnia. I couldn't sleep. I'd wake up in panic attacks in my sleep, like for no reason. My body would be in a fight or flight, like my heart pounding, racing, sweating. And I'm like, I have no thoughts in my head. What is happening to my body here? Irritability, low tolerance to stress, fatigue, just like wired but exhausted but also depleted to the point beyond tired. It was like I felt like I did not have enough life force energy in me to do a day. Like I was chronically beyond tired.
And yet you're expected to be looking after this newborn as well, right?
Newborn, and then ultimately I had another one. I ended up with two neurodiverse children, which were not easy children to raise. So yeah, and no additional support. So yeah, it was extremely, extremely difficult.
And you mentioned to me that you saw yourself as a perfectionist during this time. How did the perfectionism impact what you were going through?
Yeah. And, this is where it's really fascinating for me to reflect on because what I can see what was happening is, certainly at the time, I felt like life was pulling the rug out underneath me constantly. I didn't feel like I was a victim, but I felt very much like life was just going to throw one more curveball at me after another. And and that left this feeling of being hyper vigilant and bracing all the time. So, always being kind of in fight or flight, bracing for the next, having no sense of ability to kind of drop in and feel that, life is safe. I can just go about a day and feel at ease and trust. And as this started to happen, I eventually got to the point where I was so broken. My patterns, my coping skills, my mechanisms for doing life were so shattered that all I could drop into was curiosity, to get really curious about this experience I was having. So the perfectionist, which you mentioned, I mean, that was just one of many patterns that I would run. And if you asked me at the time, I didn't think I was a perfectionist. I wasn't trying to be a perfectionist. I would have been like, no, I don't care if I fail or my house is a mess or this happens or that happens. The perfectionist was this deep, deep desire and internal measure of if I can't do what I set out to do, then I am failing myself. So it was more about an internal pressure and expectation that my perfectionist was running versus an external. I wasn't looking for external validation. I was looking for internal validation against patterns and belief systems that served a point at one time in my life, but were ultimately now not true and no longer serving.
Hmm.
So I had to start asking, what am I making this mean? So, when little things would be happening, I'm like, what am I making this mean about myself? The fact that I can't get out of bed feeling good today, feeling like I've got a brain that's working, a body I can trust. What am I making this mean? And the voice inside would be, you're making it mean, Leah, that you're a failure, that something's wrong and you're not working hard enough. You've got to figure this out. Nobody's going to rescue you. It's all up to you. And the sense of self-preservation was so strong in survival because really this was happening at a nervous system, endocrinological level. So it's beyond logic. It's beyond emotion that for me to step outside of the only coping patterns I knew that had served me my whole life felt like I would literally disappear. Like the secret fear was that I would be non-functional, end up sedated, medicated, put away somewhere, not there for my kids, cause more pain and suffering for everybody, and still not heal because I had no faith that the medical system actually knew what they were doing. So there was this lineup of kind of two things that coincided. I mean, there was this slow beginning of curiosity, increased mindfulness, a greater awareness and understanding of the patterns, the belief systems that were running me. And that, when I kind of got to quite a pivotal place in myself with that, That is when I met the endocrinologist. And the best treatment and the only treatment for me that worked was to put me directly into menopause. And within 2 weeks of being in menopause, I was back. I had my brain back. I had my body back. I had now menopausal symptoms to deal with. But that was a walk in the park compared to everything else I had gone through. And so that gave my body the physiological leverage to start to restore, to start to nourish, to start to replenish itself, which then allowed me to drop into greater nervous system regulation. We can really get stuck in this. Why is this happening? What does this mean? What do I need to do differently? And what shifted it for me was not the why, because I had a really great understanding of the story and what was going on and, the cognitive part. What shifted it for me was the how. How am I being in relationship to this? How am I being in relationship to myself? And when I recognized I was being in relationship to myself in what, quite frankly, was an internalized, very self-abusive way, with a lot of, get it together, girl, figure this out, I realized that my internalized self-talk was actually really toxic. As I started to learn how to be different in my life, relate differently to myself, to my life, even though external challenges weren't necessarily changing, there was a level of acceptance and perspective that I began to embody, which allowed me to see and understand things in a more nuanced and different way.
So tell me about this. When you changed this narrative about yourself, when you started to change this mindset, how did you specifically relate differently to yourself?
First of all, the biggest way I related differently to myself was I actually came into my body. So instead of me being this taskmaster, thinking I could override my body to do anything I wanted to, I actually I stepped inside of my body and began to really feel what was happening, not think, but feel, and not even necessarily feel emotions, feel sensations, just acknowledge what the messaging of my body really was saying to me. And the doorway into that was through embodiment practices. There's many different types of embodiment practices, but for me, I really loved conscious dance and free dance, breathing, like mindfulness, yoga, meditation. Those really helped me begin the journey back into my body. And then ultimately, when it really, really powerfully shifted for me was when I tapped into what I call my inner artist, my creative side. And, when we think about it, it's like life is creation. And so much of the way we live today, and especially women, we put aside our creative impulses, our dreams, our desires, our inspirations, because of the tasks and the demands and the responsibilities that we carry. And I heard this really interesting quote from Brene Brown the other day. Oprah Winfrey was interviewing her, and Brene Brown, in her research, she said that unexpressed creativity is not benign, it becomes malignant.
Yeah.
And it turns into the unexpressed shame, rage, guilt. And, what I had found is that is what had happened to me. My creativity was so locked down. I didn't even have access to it. And when I began to step into my creative expression and feel that part of me and let that part of me flow through, that really helped me learn how to shift and be in relationship in my world through the eyes of an artist, let's say a creator versus a taskmaster, a doer, a must get it done. It's out of the logical, linear thinking brain that's always overanalyzing and always trying to predict and strategize into the moment of, I'm curious about this. Where am I being pulled to? What's inspiring me? And not having to figure it all out.
Yeah, you know what? I love this point that you've made here because often we think of Brinking experiences as this monumental shift from divorce or moving or death of a loved one, but it can also be what's not happening in our lives, that something is missing. And so it's this gradual depletion, right? where we're just being tapped out and drained because we aren't meeting that potential.
Absolutely, 100%. And, it's when I stopped asking myself what was wrong and I started asking myself, what am I yearning for? It was a huge perspective shift.
I love that. I love that. So you changed that belief about yourself too, that you were entitled to that.
Yeah. Yeah.
So what else changed? I mean, did any of your values or your boundaries have to change as a result of all of this?
Well, I think, yeah, I mean, ultimately everything changes, right?
Yeah.
It changes, sometimes there's micro little changes that happen subtly, and sometimes there were bigger sweeping changes. I mean, I did ultimately end up going through a divorce. And, so there were some big monumental changes that did happen. But I just began to value my relationship to myself first and foremost above everything else. I stopped seeking externally for things to get better. I stopped looking outside of myself, thinking that if I could only figure out how to change this, the value of surrender, the value of acceptance, the value of trusting, the value of vulnerability, letting myself be vulnerable and trusting this process called life. And through that, my clarity shot through the roof. It became very apparent when I needed to make a decision, what decision I needed to make. I didn't have to figure it out in my head. It would just arise in my body. My body would tell me. It was just like there would be such a strong pull somewhere or such a strong aversion that it was very easy to know what the next steps were. And they're slow and you don't always know where they're leading. I'm still don't know where my life's leading. Every day I'm like, what's the next decision or choice I need to make here in this moment? I don't know what the end game is, but I ask myself, how do I want to feel through my life? How do I want to feel going through this journey as opposed to how do I want it to look?
Yeah, that's so important. How do I want to feel? This is such an important point because I hear this from so many of the people I interview. It's no longer what do I want my life to look like going forward? It's more about what kinds of feelings do I want to be experiencing in my life going forward? Because it's the feelings that are our key to happiness, right? We might say we'd like to have $5 million, but it isn't the money that we really care about. It's how that money makes us feel, joy, freedom, excitement, possibilities. So can you explain and want to go in there in a little more detail, like how do we immerse ourselves more into the body? How do we get deeper into our hearts and bodies?
Yeah. Everybody's going to find their own unique way in as far as what is the most comfortable entry zone for them into their body, as opposed to creating an externalized list of all these to-do things that get us there. Like one of the first and most simplest step is awareness. If you just begin to be aware of the biological sensations of your body. Is my body hungry right now? Just noticing sensations in the body because the body's always communicating to us. Noticing when the body feels tired. Noticing when you feel thirsty. Noticing when you need to use the washroom. Notice how many times you ignore these sensations. And we can just begin to do that throughout our days. We need little reminders to prompt ourselves. But as we begin to start with the basic awareness, then we can go deeper into it. And then we can start to explore, the questions of, well, what am I yearning for in my life? What am I desiring? We don't have to make it this huge process where we need a weekend workshop or we've got to go find our yearnings and our desires. It can be just silently in bed at night, hand on your heart, just help me remember what I desire, what I yearn for, because I didn't know anymore. And then I just let it go and trusted that I would slowly start to find it. And I did. It slowly started to show up. You just know where you're like, oh, I'm really liking this. I'm feeling really relaxed right now. And I'm enjoying this moment, connecting in nature or connecting with this person or reading this book or whatever it might be. The next step is, beginning to bring these practices into more of actually how we do life. So it's like we learn to listen to our body more and then respond to it. Move to it. It's stuff like, oh, I'm tight, my shoulders, this. Okay, but I got to keep cooking dinner. I got to do this. It's like, no, while I'm cooking dinner for the kids and they're doing what they're doing, I'm going to put on some music and dance because that's going to help me lighten the mode and shift this energy and feel this, lighten this, dinner again, kids, right? Like, when can
I
I go to
love
bed?
that.
So it's like it's bringing it into part of your life as opposed to it being something, oh, now I need like an afternoon to get a massage or an afternoon to go to this class, or I need to get away from my world. Because the reality of it is we need to figure out how to find this in our worlds exactly as they are.
So true.
And then once that clarity is there, we will know if we need to make shifts in our world. But we might find that we don't. And, as soon as you start to, like in the example of the music, you're dancing, your whole system is changing. The hormones that are flooding your body now, your nervous system, it's all different. And so when that dish breaks or that kid has one more request or you're interrupted with one more thing, instead of it being this contraction in the body of like, oh God, one more thing, you just find you start to respond differently, or you start to perceive and notice the requests from other people that are different. And you can say like, actually, no, I can't do that for you right now. So you mentioned boundaries. Yeah, my boundaries totally changed. Absolutely. They changed. And, they changed not to keep people out and not to keep things out, but my boundaries shifted to let more of me show up.
Wow. That's fantastic.
When my boundaries started to really kind of extend from the inside out of me, it was like my children, I'll just use my children a lot as an example. Because of their neurodiversity, they could often be quite dysregulated and really infiltrate my system quite quickly. But it was almost like, I had this bubble around me and they just could not penetrate into me the way they used to. And so they started to shift, because the whole mirror neuron thing as well, right? As we shift, people around us shift their responses to our energy and our expression as well.
Yeah, very, very true. So, where are you today as a result of all of this? Like looking back now, what's your big takeaway from what you've learned from the experience?
The experience was an invitation to go deeper into myself and really be able to release a lot of the, protective armoring and ways of functioning and belief systems that I had been conditioned to take on from our society, and really gave me the complete permission and freedom to allow all of me to show up and for all of me to be here in my life, even with the demands, even with the challenges, even with the responsibilities, and just to embrace the unknown of it all.
Because that brings me to sort of my next question. What advice would you give to women who are experiencing this now? Because when you're in it at the time, self-care starts to become one more thing to do when you're operating from this deficient state, right?
Yeah.
So how would you tell women to navigate that?
In that moment, when I look back on those moments where doing anything external was impossible, what I had wished I had known to do then that I know now to do is simply just, when I got to bed at night, put my hand on my heart and just feel the warmth and the weight of my hand and just breathe and let my body speak to me. Just let
Mm.
the sensations be there, whether it's the tears, whether it's the anger, whether it's numbness, disassociation, whatever's there, and not have to analyze it, not to figure it out, just to be with me. And I feel if I could have learned earlier to be with me in those little ways throughout the days, just connecting back, I probably didn't need to spend as much time in my growth and evolution and understanding of this journey in my life.
Right. Yeah. You know what? I did a little session last night with a coach that I just interviewed, and she does something called intimate contact, where we do, a breathing technique for about 15 minutes and really to get into your body. And then what she asks you to do is, what are you feeling right now? Now that you've calmed the hell down, what are you feeling in your body? And the first thing that came to my mind was, God, I'm so tired. And so I told her, I go, I think I'm just exhausted. And she goes, so how is that showing up? And I said, I've got this mild, dull headache. And as soon as I gave that mild, dull headache a name, and I gave it permission to sort of just be heard,
Yep.
it started to dissipate
Hugely.
hugely. And so the thing is, like you say, these emotions that we're carrying around from our day, and often we're dismissing them, we're pushing them down. They're living in the body. And until we actually go in and go, hey, you deserve to be heard. So I'm going to give you the time to do that. And we're going to diffuse it. Can you imagine what we're doing to ourselves? Like in your case, day after day after day after day of dealing with this situation. 10 years later, you get a diagnosis, but you've been living like this. And so all these emotions are just building up. Of course, they're going to do something to you physically and mentally, emotionally, right?
Yeah, because we move into a place of really personal neglect.
Yeah.
And, what you described is so beautiful. It's, you found the awareness, you heard what your body was saying, you allowed it to be there, and then that's the magic. Then it moves. We don't have to go into our minds around it. So, a lot of it is the awareness of what's happening. And then if we're in a conditioned loop that we go into, then it becomes interrupting the pattern,
Yeah.
you know, and then once we interrupt the pattern, you interrupted the pattern by going into the body, feeling what you were feeling, observed the headache, and then it received your attention and it just was okay to go. It didn't need any more. No, it might have said, hey, actually, I really need some medicine or I need a big glass of water. I mean, we are always moving through states. We're
Yeah.
never meant to be in one state all the time, but we often try to get ourselves back or maintain a static state of being that we think we should be, that we think we should feel. And instead of allowing what's really there just to move through without identifying with it.
Yeah, very true. So, based on what you've been through, what do you think is missing from our culture or our health system that can better support us women who are not just struggling postpartum, but beyond that as well?
Absolutely. I mean, now at this juncture, it's all perimenopause and menopause for me in my world with everyone. I think culturally, there's so much that we're missing, right? I mean, and we're not culturally attuned to our body. We're culturally told to ignore our body, to override our body. We're told working hard is amazing. And what's that old saying? I'll sleep when I'm dead. It's, like we diminish and dismiss the value of the knowledge and the wisdom that's innate in our cells and in our being that has allowed us to evolve over millions of years to be here. So I think, culturally, seeing the body as a whole piece and honoring the wisdom of it is very, very important. All of the other things that we support it with are amazing too. Like, medicine is a fantastic thing that we have. In our medical system, it's incredibly difficult. We've got specialists operating in silos that are short on time, that really don't have tools beyond medications, which often don't always work. And then there can be a lot of contradictory information and fear-based information. There's women that suffered, decade without a lot of HRT support because of somewhat misinterpreted, erroneous study that was done on HRT and women's health initiatives. So I think it's, as women, we have to really advocate and trust ourselves and listen to that inner whisper. It's like when you're raising kids, you just say, if I can keep the connection and the communication open, I've got a chance, right? And it's the same with ourselves. If we can keep the connection to ourselves and the communication with our body and our heart and our soul open, we have a chance because it's feeding us the information we need all the time.
Absolutely. This is so important. And I mean, as you say, we do need medication, we need surgery. The medical
Sure.
system is there in place for certain things, but we do need to move back to more traditional and communal ways of dealing with physical and emotional and mental problems or conditions. I hope that we can, like you say, as we can advocate and work towards that because I feel that this is really what's missing. There's this internal cry for what we innately know about ourselves and what we need.
Absolutely. And a lot of it comes from feeling disconnected
Yeah.
from self, disconnected from partners, disconnected from life,
Community.
from community, from source, from everything. And that disconnection is an incredibly painful state to live in. And a lot of what we've focused on in our society is the cognitive piece, the talk therapy, which is important and valuable in addition with the body, in bringing the body in. We don't change just because we have the knowledge or the insight. Real transformation happens when the nervous system and the body can take the shape and form of what it's becoming and moving into. And, when you start to study the body and see how they hold their bodies changes based on what their internal states are. It's quite obvious when you look at it. There was that study where there was an African tribe and they had gone through some warfare and loss, and the Westerners came in to talk to everybody and put them in the room and have them work through their feelings and their emotions. And the tribe basically came to them and said, "This is awful. What are you doing? When we are hurting, we come together and we dance."
Ooh, I like that.
It's like when we're hurting, we tend to isolate. We go somewhere to think we need to get fixed. Sometimes we just need to come together and dance, move our bodies,
Sing.
Sing, dance, hike, paint, draw, cook a big feast, invite people. Well, you might not have energy, but like anything. There's so many powerful ways that we can start to bring more traditional ways of connecting in community, which really do support.
100%. So, Leah, you've generously provided us with a guided meditation to help women to get into our bodies and cultivate that inner dialogue with our higher self.
Yeah.
I'm going to put that on our resources page on the womenonthebrink.net website for our listeners. Again, thank you, Leah, for the time you took to put this meditation together for our listeners. So as a healthcare practitioner and a woman who has had a couple of big brinking experiences of my own, I feel it's really important that with any kind of health challenge that we look at addressing the root cause. And in most cases, trauma, hormonal changes, and burnout are the underlying cause of depression and also grief. And as in Leah's story, challenging core beliefs about self-worth and failure are super important in changing the narrative about who we are. And I love, Leah, how you really connected with your body, because we've said this over and over again, how much of it is stored in there, all the good, the bad emotions, whatever, that we've experienced over time, that's where they are. So where can people find you if they would like to learn more?
Yeah, my website is probably the best place to find me, and it's leahhawley.com.
Okay, I'll put that in the show notes. And I want to thank you, Leah, for both your transparency and your vulnerability. I think your story will touch so many women out there.
Thank you. It's been a real honor and pleasure.
So as we wrap up this episode, I just want to remind you that healing from deep depression and despair is not about rushing to fix yourself. It's about gently finding your way back to who you truly are. And it's in the small, consistent steps, the moments where, you choose to move, to reach out, to nourish your body, and to change those old beliefs, that you'll be reconnected with what brings you joy. And your journey is uniquely yours. And no matter how long it takes, every little step forward matters. And healing isn't about perfection. It's about persistence and self-compassion and the courage to keep going. So just remember, you are all stronger than you know, and you are never alone in this. Until the next time, be kind to yourself and take it one breath, one moment, and one step at a time. Thanks for joining. And I want you to know that this isn't just a podcast. This is a movement. So share this information with your friends and let's go, ladies.